Praise be Jesus and Mary.
Now and forever.
The times have changed, they say, and the Church needs to get with the times. It's normal today for people to live together without getting married. It's normal to divorce and remarry. It's normal to have a partner of the same sex. God's law was written thousands of years ago. How can it still be useful for us today? The world is a different place. It's changed so much. But Jesus Christ, who is the truth in person, solemnly proclaims, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or the smallest part of a letter will pass from the law until all things have taken place. Now, there are some parts of the old law that have passed away because they spoke of things that have already taken place. The sacrifices of the old law foreshadowed the sacrifice of Christ, and this has taken place. Similarly, circumcision, to take one of the rites in particular, sought deliverance from original sin by looking forward to the shedding of Christ's blood for our deliverance, and that began with his circumcision. Now we enter into the covenant by circumcising our hearts in baptism. The various laws concerning bodily purity were instituted to teach the purity of heart we must have to approach the holy mysteries. And so if we are seeking purity of heart, then what the old rites referred to has already been fulfilled. So all these parts of the old law regarded things that have taken place, regarded things that took place when Christ came especially, or things that continue to be fulfilled in some way. But the moral law, on the other hand, is perennially valid. It does not change because it corresponds to human nature, and human nature is the same in every time and place. Christ brings means of grace that make it possible to fulfill the moral law with constancy and eliminate that hardness of heart which led Moses to tolerate divorce. In contrast with the Sermon on the Mount, Christ also, or not in contrast, rather, but in the context of the Sermon on the Mount, because these words are taken from the Sermon on the Mount, the words that we heard in the Gospel. In this context, Christ also brings the moral law to fulfillment by insisting on its interior aspect. That is, he insists that the Gospel law is not to be conceived of in the same way as civil law. Civil law deals with external actions, because that is what people can see and judge. So however much hatred and contempt someone has in his heart, if he doesn't express that in some external action, he will never go to jail or be fined or suffer any other consequence from the civil law. And this was really the way that the Pharisees were often thinking of the law of God, like another law, like the civil law. So whatever you had in your heart, whether it was lust or hatred or whatever else, that didn't really matter to God. He only cared about what you did externally, like the civil law only cares about what you do externally. But that's not the case. So Jesus insists, is fulfilling the law, is bringing the law to perfection by insisting that no, God cares about the heart. God looks at the heart and will condemn the man who hates his neighbor, even if that hatred remains within him. It is love that fulfills God's law, and therefore hatred violates it. And for it says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So when it comes to the moral precepts of the law, Christ brings them to fulfillment in these two ways, by giving us means of grace in order to fulfill them, and by insisting on their interior dimension, so that we will fulfill them not externally, but as they were truly meant, as rules for our heart. And so while it is more demanding objectively, the law of the gospel, because of its insistence that we cannot even have hatred or lust in our heart, at least not voluntarily, it is, on the other hand, easier to observe because of the means of grace that God offers us. So because Christ brought the law to perfection, there can be no further fulfillment or replacement of the gospel law. We do not look for any further revelation. What is already perfect, if it is changed in any way, becomes less perfect. And so the perfect law is the law that lasts forever. or at the very least until the end of time, after which there will no longer be any possibility to commit sin. So as Moses says in the first reading, careful observance of God's law gives evidence of wisdom and intelligence to the nations. And conversely, if observing it is evidence of wisdom and intelligence, then neglecting God's law is evidence of folly and stupidity. The truth of what Moses says is demonstrated by history, because if we look at the time of Christ, there were many pagans who admired the law of Moses because they saw that it corresponded to much that their philosophers had discovered. It was a more philosophical, a more reasonable religion than their own Roman religion. And so they came to the synagogues, especially women who didn't have the public obligations to engage in the cult of the gods. So as the first reading points out, it is a privilege for us, as it was for the Jews, to know God's law. And this law is the foundation of the civilization of love, of the culture of life. A civilization and a culture that recognizes human dignity and enables us to reach a degree of intimacy with God unknown to the pagans. The psalm emphasizes this same point, our good fortune. He has proclaimed his word to Jacob, his statutes and ordinances to Israel. He has not done this for any other nation. His ordinances he has not made known to them. It's an even greater privilege for us to know the Holy Gospel, through which we can come to an intimacy with God unknown even to the Jews. But this privilege is also granted for the benefit of all mankind, because the people of God is to be the light of the nations. This was already true of the people of Israel, but they fulfilled that calling only imperfectly. They did, to a certain extent, begin to convince pagans of the goodness of God's law and lead them to enter the synagogues, usually just by observing the moral law and not by becoming circumcised, but some of them even received circumcision or converted completely to Judaism in the case of women. But when Christ came to fulfill the law, he made the church the lumen gentium, the light of the nations. So when St. Matthew described the beginning of Jesus' preaching, he pointed out that he was fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy. The people who sit in darkness have seen a great light. On those dwelling in a land overshadowed by death, light has arisen. It is the light of Christ's teaching, the light that the Church continues to bring to the world. To some extent, we see the light of God's law influencing even non-Christian cultures. Christianity teaches human dignity. It leads to a realization that man is not property, he's not like the animals, but he has a dignity. He is made to love, made to love God. And this is true of him regardless of his social status, regardless of what culture he comes from. And from this awareness of human dignity come affirmations of human rights. And so these human rights can come to be recognized even by non-Christian nations. To a certain extent, the UN Declaration of Human Rights was a positive step forward, even though it's not fully in accord with the gospel. Still, it recognizes much of the truth that the gospel teaches. And Christ's teaching about love of neighbor, on the other hand, led Christians to create the first hospitals, and now there are hospitals all over the world. But where the Christian influence declines, these institutions become distorted and then cease to really serve mankind. So on the model of human rights, then other rights are declared, rights which do not correspond to the truth about human nature, but to the ideological goals of activists. Hospitals and hospices continue to serve the sick and injured, but sometimes for profit rather than for love. Sometimes they offer death rather than life. And so let us be wise and intelligent, living by God's law, taught to us through the Holy Gospel, and building up the civilization of love. Praised be Jesus and Mary.
Now and forever.